Most people are terrified of their own company, and they have absolutely no idea that this terror is the very thing standing between them and the most important version of themselves they will ever meet. There is a version of you that nobody has ever seen. Not your closest friend. Not your partner. Not the parent who raised you or the colleague who sits 3 feet from you every day. Not even you, not yet, because this version of yourself only surfaces in one specific condition that most people spend their entire lives desperately, unconsciously avoiding. Solitude. Real solitude. Not the solitude of scrolling alone in a room full of other people's voices. Not the solitude of sitting in silence while your mind rehearses conversations and replays arguments and plans tomorrow's schedule. But genuine, unmediated, honest-to-God solitude, the kind where it is just you, and your thoughts, and the raw unfiltered experience of being a human being alive in the world with no performance required and no audience to play to. Most people never get there. Not because life doesn't offer the opportunity, but because the moment the silence arrives, the moment the noise stops and the space opens, something in them reaches immediately for the phone, the television, the friend, the distraction. Anything to avoid sitting in the one company they find most uncomfortable. Their own. And here on the Stoic path, we are going to talk about why that avoidance is costing you everything. And we are going to walk through 10 things you must do alone at least once in your life, not because solitude is some romantic ideal, but because each of these experiences will show you something about yourself that no relationship, no achievement, no external validation can ever reveal. Stay with me. This one is important. 1. Eat a meal alone. Slowly. Without your phone. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple. And yet, try it. Actually try it. Sit down to a full meal, in a restaurant or in your own kitchen, with no phone on the table, no book open beside you, no podcast playing in the background. Just you and the food and the experience of eating. For most people, within the first 3 minutes, something deeply uncomfortable begins to happen. The mind starts to move. Not pleasantly at first. It starts to inventory. To rehearse. To worry. To plan. It starts doing everything it can to avoid the simple, present, unremarkable experience of just eating. Being here. Being you. There was a man named Elliot who traveled frequently for work. He ate most of his meals alone in hotel restaurants, but he had never, not once, eaten a meal without his phone as a companion. It was always there. Propped against the salt shaker. Glowing softly. A buffer between him and the potential discomfort of his own company. One evening, his phone died at dinner. The charger was upstairs. He was already seated. The food had already been ordered. For the first 40 years of his life, Elliot had been one of the most intellectually active people in any room. But that evening, forced into genuine presence with himself for 45 minutes over a plate of pasta, he discovered something that shook him quietly but completely. He had opinions he had never articulated, even to himself. Feelings he had been moving too fast to notice. A low, persistent dissatisfaction with a specific area of his life that had been trying to get his attention for years, and that he had been successfully outrunning with noise. The phone dying was the most productive thing that happened to him that year. The Stoics placed enormous value on what they called attentiveness to the present moment. Marcus Aurelius returned to it constantly in his meditations, this practice of being fully, consciously, deliberately here. Not in the past. Not in the future. Not in someone else's curated highlights. Here. Eating alone, slowly, presently, without the escape hatch of a screen, is the practice of being here. And what you find here, when you stop running from it, will tell you more about where your life actually is than 100 conversations with people who only know the version of you that's been performing. Do this. At least once. And pay attention to what surfaces in the silence. 2. Travel somewhere alone. Not a business trip. Not a solo leg of a family vacation. An intentional journey, somewhere you chose, for reasons that belong entirely to you, taken entirely in your own company. Here is what travel does when you are alone that it simply cannot do when you are with others. It removes the social scaffolding. When you travel with people, the experience is always, inevitably, naturally, necessarily, mediated through the group. Decisions are negotiated. The day is shaped by consensus. Your reactions to what you encounter are immediately shared and processed collectively. There is warmth in this. There is joy in this. But there is also something lost. The raw, unmediated encounter between you and the world. When you travel alone, something different happens. You make every decision. Where to go. When to stop. What to linger over. What to skip. How long to sit in that square watching the pigeons and the old men playing chess and the children running between their parents' legs. You answer to nothing except your own genuine interest and your own genuine energy. And in those decisions, dozens of them, daily, unwitnessed by anyone, you learn what you actually like. What you are actually curious about. What moves you when no one is watching to be moved. A woman named Adiz saved for 2 years to take a solo trip to Portugal. Everyone in her life had concerns. Is it safe? Won't you be lonely? Aren't you nervous? She smiled and nodded and took the trip anyway. On the third day, sitting on a hillside in Sintra watching the Atlantic push itself against ancient rocks below her, she had a realization so simple and so enormous that she wrote it in her journal with shaking hands. I have never, in my entire adult life, known what I wanted to do next without asking someone else first. 41 years old. Accomplished. Loved. Surrounded by people. And she had never known, until that hillside, that she had entirely outsourced the navigation of her own life. The solo trip didn't fix everything. But it showed her the map. And the map, the honest, unmediated, nobody else is watching map of her own desires and instincts and preferences, was something she had never held before. You cannot find that map in company. It only appears in solitude. And it is one of the most valuable documents you will ever read. 3. Spend a full day without speaking. 1 full day. No conversations. No phone calls. No social media exchanges that are conversations wearing a digital costume. Complete communicative silence from the moment you wake until the moment you sleep. This is not about punishment. It is not about mysticism. It is about something very specific and very practical. Understanding how much of what you say every day is genuinely yours, and how much of it is filler. Performance. The social noise of a person who has not yet learned to be comfortable in silence. The average person speaks approximately 16,000 words per day. 16,000 words. And if you were to examine those 16,000 words honestly, to hold them up to the light and ask which ones were authentic expressions of genuine thought and feeling, and which ones were reflexive social maintenance, performance of a role, management of other people's perceptions, or simply sound used to fill the space that silence would otherwise occupy, the answer would be humbling. Because most of us talk far more than we think. And think far less than we believe. The day of silence creates a specific kind of pressure that is extraordinarily productive. When the outlet of speech is removed, the interior life intensifies. Thoughts that usually get externalized before they are fully formed are forced to complete themselves internally. Feelings that usually get managed through conversation are required to be sat with, examined, experienced fully. A man named Kwame took a day of silence after a period of enormous professional turmoil. He didn't plan anything profound. He simply decided that for one day he would not speak. By mid-morning he noticed something he had never noticed before. The constant internal commentary, the voice that narrated and judged and planned and worried, was quieter than usual. As if, freed from the responsibility of producing external speech, it had relaxed. By afternoon, in that unusual quiet, he had clarity about a decision he had been arguing with himself about for months. Not because silence gave him the answer. But because silence finally gave him enough room to hear the answer he had already known. The philosopher Epictetus, a man who had every reason to fill the world with noise and grievance, taught something that feels almost radical in the modern context. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. A day of silence is a day of listening. To the world. To yourself. To the parts of your interior life that have been waiting patiently for the talking to stop. Give them that day. At least once. 4. Sit with a hard emotion without trying to fix it. This one requires no travel. No planning. No particular conditions. It requires only one thing, and that one thing is the hardest thing most human beings are ever asked to do. Sit still while you feel something painful. And do nothing about it except feel it. Not analyze it. Not call someone to process it. Not eat over it or drink over it or scroll over it or exercise it into exhaustion. Not reframe it prematurely into a lesson or a blessing or a growth opportunity. Just feel it. Fully. Alone. We live in a culture that has declared war on discomfort. Every negative emotion is treated as a problem requiring immediate solution. Sadness needs to be cheered up. Anger needs to be vented. Anxiety needs to be managed. Grief needs to be processed on a timeline. Loneliness needs to be remedied by connection. And in this relentless problem-solving approach to our own emotional lives, we have robbed ourselves of something essential. The experience of knowing that we can survive our own feelings. There is a woman named Miriam who lost her closest friend suddenly and without warning. In the weeks that followed, everyone around her was extraordinary, present, caring, available, generous with their time and their comfort. She was never alone with the grief. And then, one evening, everyone had gone home. And Miriam sat in her living room with the grief and nothing else. For the first hour she fought it. Reached for her phone. Put it down. Turned on the television. Turned it off. Made tea she didn't drink. And then, exhausted by the fighting, she stopped. She just sat. And let it be as large as it actually was. What happened in the next hour was not what she expected. She expected to be destroyed by it. What happened instead was that the grief, given full permission, full space, full acknowledgement, moved through her. Not away. Through. Like weather passing. Like a wave that had been held at bay by all the managing and the comforting and the not being alone, finally allowed to break on the shore and recede. She didn't feel better when it was over. But she felt something more important than better. She felt capable. Capable of her own experience. Capable of surviving her own interior weather without requiring someone to rescue her from it. The Stoics called this capacity equanimity. Not the absence of feeling. The ability to hold feeling without being destroyed by it. To be moved without being swept away. You build that capacity in solitude. In the moments when you choose to stay with the feeling instead of running from it. In the quiet, private, enormously courageous act of trusting that you can survive your own heart. Do this alone. At least once. It will show you that you are stronger than everything you have been afraid to feel. 5. Watch the sun rise without telling anyone. Not for the photograph. Not for the caption. Not so you can tell someone later, I watched the sunrise this morning, and receive the small warm glow of their admiration. Watch it for no one but yourself. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Because we live in a moment in history where almost no experience is considered complete until it has been witnessed by others, shared, validated, acknowledged. Even our most private moments have become content. Even our solitude has become performance. And what this has done, quietly, insidiously, over years of scrolling and sharing and curating, is erode our ability to experience things for their own sake. For the pure, private, unrepeatable joy of a moment that exists only between you and the world. When you watch a sunrise alone, truly alone, with no documentation planned and no story being prepared, something different happens. You are just there. Watching light happen. Watching the world rebegin. Watching something ancient and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful do what it has been doing for 4.5 billion years, with or without an audience, with or without your approval, with or without your caption. And in that watching, something in you quiets. Something in you that has been performing, managing, optimizing, producing, rests. Seneca wrote, Omnia aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum est. Everything is alien to us. Time alone is ours. The sunrise asks nothing of you. It gives everything. And receiving it, fully, privately, with no plan to share it, is one of the purest acts of presence available to a human being in the modern world. Do it at least once. And notice how it feels to experience something beautiful that belongs only to you. 5 down. And I want you to feel something right now, not just intellectual interest, but a genuine pull. A recognition. Because what we are really talking about in each of these is not an activity. It is an encounter. An encounter with yourself. The unperformed, unmediated, honest version of you that only appears when the audience is gone and the noise is quiet and the only person left in the room is the one you were born as. That person has been waiting for you. There is something that happens to a person who has spent real time alone. Not isolated. Not lonely. Not abandoned. But genuinely, intentionally, chosen alone. Something settles in them. Something firms up. Something that was previously dependent on external conditions, other people's moods, other people's validation, the noise and motion and social scaffolding of a constantly connected life, begins to find its footing inside rather than outside. They become, in the most literal and the most profound sense, self-possessed. And self-possession, the quiet, unshakable, deeply attractive quality of a person who is fully at home in their own company, is one of the rarest and most powerful things a human being can develop. In part 1 we covered the first 5 things you must do alone at least once in your life. We talked about eating in presence. Traveling without a companion. Spending a day in silence. Sitting with a hard emotion without fixing it. And watching a sunrise for no one but yourself. Each of those was a door. In part 2, we walk through 5 more. And these go to the places that require the most honesty. The most courage. The most genuine willingness to encounter yourself without the comfortable buffer of other people's presence. Let's go. 6. Write a letter to yourself that no one will ever read. Not a journal entry. Not a list of goals. Not a morning pages exercise designed to clear creative blockages. A letter. Written to yourself. With the full and absolute understanding that no human eye will ever read it except your own. This distinction, the guarantee of complete privacy, changes everything about what gets written. Because here is what most people discover when they try to be honest in writing, they are still performing. Even alone, even in a private journal, there is a quiet awareness that someone might one day read these words. A future partner finding the journal. A biographer examining the archive. Even the future self who will reread it. And that awareness, however faint, however unconscious, edits the honesty before it reaches the page. The letter that will never be read has no audience to perform for. And in that complete absence of audience, things surface that have never been spoken. Not to therapists. Not to best friends. Not to anyone. Because they have never been given the conditions in which they could emerge safely. There was a man named Bernard who was 63 years old and had spent his entire professional life as a man of precise, disciplined, carefully chosen words. He was a lawyer. Language was his instrument and he wielded it with extraordinary control. One evening, his therapist gave him an unusual instruction. Write a letter to yourself. About the thing you have never said out loud to anyone. About the version of your life that you chose not to live. And then, do not bring it to our next session. Keep it. Or burn it. But do not show it to me or anyone else. Bernard resisted for 3 weeks. Then he sat down one night and wrote for 4 hours without stopping. He wrote about the career he had abandoned at 26 because his father's expectations were louder than his own desires. He wrote about a relationship he had ended for reasons that sounded reasonable to everyone around him and that he had known, in the moment of ending it, were not the real reasons. He wrote about the fear, the specific, particular, long-carried fear, that sat underneath the precision and the control and the carefully chosen words. He wrote things he had never thought clearly enough to articulate. Because the act of writing, for no audience, with no consequence, with no version of himself that needed to be maintained or protected, gave those things permission to become clear. He didn't show the letter to anyone. But the man who walked into his therapist's office 3 weeks later was different from the man who had walked out. Not because the letter fixed anything, but because knowing, truly, completely, honestly knowing, what is actually inside you is the precondition for every genuine act of change. You cannot renovate a house you have never honestly inspected. Write the letter. Burn it if you need to. But write it. Completely. Honestly. For no one but the truest version of yourself. And discover, in those pages, what has been waiting to be known. 7. Make a decision that only affects you, entirely on your own terms. This one sounds simple. It is not. Because most people, when examined honestly, have never made a truly independent decision in their lives. Not one that was conceived entirely from their own desires, evaluated entirely by their own judgment, and executed entirely without seeking permission, consensus, or validation from the people around them. Every major decision has been run through a committee. Not an official committee. The informal, invisible, constantly convened committee of other people's opinions that most of us carry with us everywhere we go. What will my parents think? What will my partner say? Will my friends understand? How will this look to the people whose opinion I value? What if I'm wrong, and someone I respect could have told me so in advance? This committee is not always wrong. Counsel from people who know and love you is genuinely valuable. The Stoics honored it. Marcus Aurelius actively sought out people who would challenge his thinking and correct his errors. But there is a profound difference between seeking counsel and requiring permission. Between valuing input and being unable to act without it. Between consulting others as part of a decision and being incapable of making a decision without them. The person who has never made a truly independent decision does not know what they actually think. They know what they think after it has been filtered through everyone else's reactions. They know what they want after it has been shaped by what seems acceptable to the people around them. They know who they are, but only in relation to other people. Never in isolation. A woman named Patience had spent 44 years making every significant choice with her mother's voice in her head. Not because her mother was domineering. But because Patience had simply never practiced the muscle of autonomous judgment. It had never occurred to her to make a decision, a real, significant, life-affecting decision, and simply trust herself to make it. At 44 she decided to leave her stable government job and start a business. She told no one. Not her mother. Not her husband. Not her closest friends. For 30 days she worked through the decision entirely alone, researching, planning, sitting with the fear, examining the desire, stress-testing her own reasoning without the assistance or the interference of anyone else's perspective. At the end of 30 days she brought her decision to her husband. Fully formed. Completely considered. Utterly her own. And something in the way she presented it, the steadiness, the clarity, the absolute absence of the seeking permission energy that had characterized every previous major decision she had brought to him, told him, before she had finished speaking, that this was different. This was not a proposal. This was an announcement. The business succeeded. But even if it hadn't, the woman who made that decision had accessed something that the outcome could not take back. The experience of trusting herself. Completely. For the first time. That experience changes a person permanently. And it is only available in solitude. Because the moment you invite someone else into the process, the moment the committee convenes, it is no longer your decision alone. Make one. fully. Without the committee. 8. Spend time in nature with no destination and no timeline. Not a hike with a summit to reach. Not a walk with a route planned and a time to be back. Not exercise in the outdoors, which is a different thing entirely from what I am describing. Time in nature. Without destination. Without timeline. Without purpose beyond the simple, radical, countercultural act of being in the natural world with no agenda except presence. This matters in a very specific way for the modern human being, because the modern human being lives almost entirely inside the built environment. Inside buildings, inside vehicles, inside digital spaces, inside the human-constructed systems of work and commerce and social life. And the built environment, for all its extraordinary utility, does one thing consistently that the natural world does not. It demands. Every element of the built environment is asking something of you. The inbox asks for responses. The schedule asks for adherence. The street asks for navigation. The social context asks for appropriate behavior. Even the home, the supposedly restorative space, is full of things that need doing, things that remind you of things that need doing, and things that have not yet been done. Nature asks nothing. The forest does not need you to respond to it. The river does not require your productivity. The mountain does not care about your to-do list. The sky does not adjust itself based on your schedule. And in the presence of something that asks nothing of you, something in you that has been clenched in response to the constant asking, begins, slowly, to release. There was a young woman named Saoirse who worked in technology and had not taken a day off in 11 months. Not because she lacked vacation days but because she had reached a point where she genuinely could not conceive of a day that was not structured around output. Rest had stopped being something she knew how to do. Her doctor, concerned about her blood pressure and her sleep and the look in her eyes that doctors sometimes recognize before the patient does, gave her a prescription that was not pharmaceutical. Go outside. Somewhere green. Bring nothing. Produce nothing. Come back when you feel like coming back. Saoirse found it almost unbearable for the first 2 hours. The absence of task felt like failure. The silence felt like irresponsibility. She kept reaching for her phone and finding it at home where she had deliberately left it. By the 3rd hour, something shifted. She sat beside a stream and watched the water move, not thinking about the water, not analyzing the water, not photographing the water, just watching it, the way a child watches things, with pure uncomplicated attention that isn't working toward anything. And for the first time in 11 months, her mind went quiet. Not empty. Quiet. There is a difference. Quiet minds are not absent. They are present in a way that busy minds never can be. Seneca wrote about the restorative power of withdrawing from the noise of human society, returning to something older and slower and less interested in your productivity. He understood, 2,000 years before neuroscience confirmed it, that the human mind needs contact with unhurried things in order to remember its own unhurried nature. Go to nature alone. With no destination. No timeline. No goal. And let it remind you of the part of yourself that existed before the world started asking so much of you. 9. Revisit a version of yourself you left behind. Somewhere between who you were and who you became, something got left. Not lost, necessarily. Not destroyed. Just, set down. Put aside. Quietly abandoned in the process of becoming the person that life, circumstance, responsibility, and other people's expectations required you to become. Maybe it was a creative pursuit. The painting you stopped doing when it became clear it wasn't going to be a career. The writing you put away when life got practical. The music that used to be as natural as breathing and that you haven't touched in so many years you've started to believe you've simply outgrown it. Maybe it was a quality. The spontaneity you had at 22 that got trained out of you by years of responsibility. The openness you had before you were hurt in ways that made openness expensive. The lightness you had before the weight of adult life settled permanently across your shoulders. Maybe it was a dream. The thing you wanted before you were old enough to be told what was realistic. The vision of a life that made your eyes bright before the world taught you to be practical. Whatever it is still there. Not waiting impatiently. Not demanding return. Just, there. Quietly present in the way that essential things always remain, even when we have not visited them in years. A man named Osei had played the piano from the age of 7 until the age of 24. Seriously. Beautifully. With a natural gift that his teachers spoke about with a kind of reverence that embarrassed him when he was young and that he had spent 20 years quietly mourning. Life had happened. As it always does. Career. Family. Mortgages. Priorities that were real and legitimate and that he had chosen with his eyes open. At 44, he sat down at a piano for the first time in 20 years. Alone. Late at night. In a practice room at a community music school that rented space by the hour. His hands remembered things his mind had forgotten. The first 20 minutes were painful, the gap between who he had been and who his hands were now was humbling and real. But he stayed. And somewhere in the second hour something extraordinary happened that he would try, unsuccessfully, to describe to his wife later that night. He came back to himself. Not to the 24-year-old. Not to the version of himself that had left. But to something underneath all the versions, something continuous and essential and alive that the piano had always been able to access and that 20 years of not playing had not, it turned out, extinguished. He wept on the drive home. Not from sadness. From recognition. Go back to the thing you left. Alone. Without performing the return for anyone. Just, go back. Sit with it. Let it show you what it kept of you while you were away. 10. Sit with the question of who you are without the roles you play. This is the final one. The deepest one. The one that all the others have been preparing you for. Because everything we have talked about, the meal eaten in presence, the solo journey, the day of silence, the unread letter, the decision made alone, the return to what was left behind, all of it has been circling this central question. Who are you when you are no one's anything? Not someone's child. Not someone's partner. Not someone's colleague or employee or employer or friend. Not the role that your job requires. Not the identity that your social context provides. Not the version of yourself that exists in other people's perceptions and expectations and needs. Just you. The irreducible, unrollable, original human being that exists underneath all the costumes that life requires you to wear. Most people have no idea. And this is not a criticism. It is simply the inevitable result of a life lived primarily in relation to others, which is, for most people, the only kind of life they have ever known how to live. We are taught, from the very beginning of our existence, to define ourselves in relation. Son or daughter. Student or graduate. Employee or employer. Partner or parent. Friend or rival. We are always something, always in relationship to something else. And the question of who we are without those relationships is one that most people never sit with long enough to receive an answer. The Stoics had a practice they called memento mori, the contemplation of death. Not morbidly. Not despairingly. But as the most clarifying lens available to human consciousness. Because when you sit with the reality that one day all the roles will end, all the titles will dissolve, all the relationships will conclude, all the external definitions will fall away, what remains? What is the thing that was there before the first role was assigned, and that will be there when the last one is relinquished? That is the self the Stoics were interested in. The hegemonikon, the governing faculty, the essential core. The part that chooses, values, responds, and ultimately determines the quality of a human life. Sitting with this question alone, genuinely, patiently, without rushing toward an answer, is one of the most important things a human being can do. Not because the answer arrives quickly. It rarely does. But because the sitting itself, the willingness to remain in the question rather than escaping back into the comfort of the roles, begins to show you something. Slowly. In the way that deep things always reveal themselves. Not all at once. In glimpses. In quiet moments of recognition that accumulate over time into something that feels, eventually, like knowing. There was a woman named Adana who took 3 days alone, completely alone, in a rented cabin with no internet and no company, after her last child left for university. An empty nest. A quiet house. A life that had been organized, for 22 years, around the role of mother. She did not know who she was without it. Not entirely. Not at the level that mattered. And those 3 days, uncomfortable, disorienting, at times genuinely frightening in their quiet, gave her something that the 22 years of devoted, loving, extraordinary motherhood could not have given her. They gave her back herself. Not instead of the mother. Not in replacement of the role. But underneath it. Alongside it. The woman who had been there before the first child arrived and who had been quietly, patiently waiting through 2 decades of beautiful, necessary, life-consuming devotion, for the moment when there was enough silence to hear her again. Sit with the question. Alone. Without rushing. Who are you when you are no one's anything?